Hello, my name is Ed Palacios, formerly Colonel Ed Palacios of the United States Army. After 36 years of service in the U.S. Army, I retired last October and began teaching junior ROTC at a local Fort Worth high school. I have a passion for history, and that's why I'm seeking my PhD. Because of my military history, in this particular course, the African American experience, I chose to do research on what was called the Camp Logan Mutiny of 1917 and its influence on the U.S. Army attitudes towards African American soldiers. Now, I've always been interested in this story, and what's interesting to me is how few people really know what the story is. I even called the local NAACP to see if they had any kind of primary or secondary sources that I could use for my research, and they didn't know what I was talking about. But what's interesting is that this particular incident was the catalyst for the largest trial in U.S. history. So on August 23rd, 1917, 156 members of the 3rd Battalion, 24th Infantry Regiment conducted a riot in downtown Houston, Texas. Now, this was a regiment that was a segregated regiment, and normally they were posted out in New Mexico. But they were trained to Houston, Texas, to guard a new camp that was being built in support of World War I called Camp Logan. Unfortunately, most of these soldiers in this regiment were not used to the Southern Jim Crow laws. And so when they arrived in Houston, they found themselves the subject of a tremendous amount of animosity, a type of animosity they weren't used to. And then, frankly, they didn't feel like they deserved, since they were serving our country. After abuse by the local police and local civilians, they had finally reached a breaking point, and they marched on downtown Houston, and they brought their weapons and their ammunition, and they ultimately ended up killing a number of civilians and 4 police officers, and 4 of them were subsequently killed in the riot as well. This led to the largest trial in U.S. history. There were 3 separate court-martials where all 156 members of this battalion were tried, and as a result of it, 19 were ultimately hanged, and 63 of them were sentenced to life in prison. Now, initially, my research was to determine whether this incident had any reflection or any influence on the way that the African American soldiers were treated in France during World War I. As I conducted more research, what I was able to determine was that there is no specific evidence that relates from this incident to how the African Americans were treated. Now, there's 2 African American infantry divisions that were created, the 92nd and the 93rd Infantry Divisions. Both were segregated units. Both units had African American officers, but only at the junior levels. The senior officers were all white. And ironically, the senior officers of these units did not have much faith in the African American soldiers they led. And when the 92nd Infantry Division went into battle only 6 weeks after arriving in France, they had difficulty. These were under-trained soldiers. They were under-equipped. You know, they're immediately thrust into a significant battle of the Meuse-Argonne, and they were unable to meet some of their objectives. Rather than compare them to the other infantry units that were white, who had some of the same problems, their failures were immediately attributed to their race. And so ultimately my research became more of, you know, if Camp Logan had an influence on the way they were treated or not. And if not, what led to that kind of treatment? And my conclusions were that there was a significant amount of institutional racism in the Army that, and for some reason, the Army's senior officers were mostly made up of soldiers from southern states. So they carried their racism and their animosity with them into the battlefield, and it had a pronounced effect on the way that these soldiers were treated. Thank you very much. I appreciate your time.